Yeah. So now we're recording, so we can have
Okay.
everything will be set for Savannah. Well, thanks so much, Jeremy, for being willing to talk to me a little bit about my ideas behind the show in terms of like storytelling, art making, and the relationship between art and truth. Those are kind of the ideas that I was kind of were swirling around in the back of my head when I was putting the show together. And I think what got me started was kind of, maybe shelves in the library where we have fiction and nonfiction. And we don't, I mean, it's kind of funny that we don't have fiction and truth or fiction and reality. We have fiction and nonfiction. Because I think maybe as a culture, we were uncomfortable with truth. And certainly the culture that I was brought up in, the kind of the art world of the 80s and 90s, the idea that you would pursue truth in your art you would be laughed at if you said like, well, I'm really looking for truth, because the idea then was it was kind of this moment of high cynicism where like nothing could be believed or trusted, and truth was like a conspiracy by old white European guys to keep everyone else down. But as I've been involved with the arts more, and especially since the most recent administration has taken over the country with ideas of like, truth can be something invented every 15 seconds to serve your narrow-minded political ends. I started looking at art maybe as a way of telling the truth. And I wanted to just ask you a few, if your thoughts rhymed with those thoughts, or how they overlapped with those thoughts, or if they differed with those thoughts.
Well, that's a great way to start the conversation, especially with the theme of storytelling, because in my view, storytelling and truth are kind of like that muddy water where there is no right way to tell a story.
Huh?
And I look at so many things that we think of as facts, like history and other things through storytelling. So depending on who you ask and who tells a story, the truth might kind of be flexible, and perhaps there is no one truth because no one experiences the collective experience. There's always, well, someone felt one thing, or someone else felt something else, or someone saw something, or someone told a different version of what they saw. So I totally agree that there is sort of like this controversial theme going through like art and approaching truth as a means.
So has that changed much since you started out, say when you were in undergrad and then a grad and then after school, or was it pretty consistent all the way through?
In undergrad, I wasn't really working on kind of like the thread of what I have in my mind and like what I'm looking at and reading. In grad school, it was a little bit similar to that experience, but I was looking more at mythology and that type of storytelling where there is, like, first of all, when you say mythology, people are going to separate that from truth pretty distantly.
So would you kind of get an eye roll if you said, I'm interested in mythology? It was like, oh, geez, here's another lost soul? Or would it be, he's doing historical work, looking at past cultures who had beliefs like that?
Well, I even had my own bias looking at mythology because I'm a skeptic and I'm not very spiritual. But over time, just spending a lot of time with these stories, reading them, trying to envision like how could these possibly happen. I think I kind of convinced myself that, yeah, there is some way that someone could have experienced this through dreams, through hallucinations or whatever. And I thought that in a sense, I was going towards truth in that way. Rather than like, okay, I'm just going to like look at this as if it's like false and someone made it up, rather than what I was looking at originally.
So you felt that the maybe reality was more complicated than positivism or objectivity or science or just reporting the facts could acknowledge.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Especially with kind of like the age we're in, the information age, we kind of throw away anything that like doesn't have a reference, doesn't have a specific year and date. doesn't have like a concrete author.
And so for you, would you say that your kind of interest in the visual arts and in being a visual artist or living as a visual artist just came together with your desire to tell stories that might be true or could be true, or?
Well, I approach art and visual art very practically. So I kind of separate myself from other artists, and I wish I kind of like crossed the line and joined them. Where it's kind of like art for art's sake, rather than being like, okay, how is this going to be useful to someone in the future? And so the way I look at it is, especially being indigenous and an indigenous artist, the idea of truth in art is very powerful, and it opens up a lot of different potentials to reveal like a different side of the story or a different side of the historical moment. And so as an artist, I look at those moments and I relish in like that moment. I try to spend as much time as I can kind of like looking at what other people looked at in terms of research or original texts, and trying to say, okay, like what did they leave out? What did they kind of think was, like we were saying with mythology, like not even useful because of how it was presented.
So would you think of yourself as a part amateur historian, or like part-time researcher and part-time artist? How many different hats do you wear as an artist?
Oh, definitely an amateur historian and maybe anthropologist and researcher. I think a lot of my work wouldn't be possible without just like the enormous amount of time and effort by previous professional historians. But the more I kind of spend within those communities, just getting advice and getting some of the archive access, the more I realize that there's just like so much formalities in terms of how they can present that work. Whereas as an artist, I can kind of like create this whole tableau or just like go crazy with it. And for some reason, people still respect kind of like the history and the facts behind it, even though it's not like in a textbook or in like a scientific diagram.
Yeah, I love the way you phrase that, where you can, to me, it's like images count and images matter and images mean. And I think a lot of time historians often don't think that way. Like if you can't find a footnote or a reference or a journal or something written, it almost doesn't exist.
Absolutely.
And like, what's the balance between you, kind of like you with your nose in the archives going through stuff, and you out with a crew shooting things? Is it 50-50? Is it 90-10?
Well, the way I work, I never really had a traditional artist studio outside of grad school, which was a 2-year program. And so, like you said, it's probably 90% just like reading, planning, and sketching ideas from this gathered resource. And then 10% of the time when I'm like awarded an artist residency, I'm happy to go out and collaborate and have like a crew or just myself and another person create this body of work.
So most of it is kind of you on your own working, because I teach in an art school, and it's a studio school. And you know, when the pandemic started and the kind of safer at home orders were issued, it kept students from going to their studios, which for some was really detrimental to what they wanted to do. And other ones kind of, you know, it's like, yeah, it's an inconvenience. I don't get to see my peers and talk to them, but my art practice is thriving. Would you be in which of those two categories would you fall into?
I can see both sides, definitely, but in my case, it's really strange because in artist residencies, you do get a generous offering of a residential space for the month and a studio. But to me, it's less so the access to the studio rather than that atmosphere where people are there for a short amount of time. You have to be as productive as possible in many cases. And you're kind of putting yourself in a new community and environment of people. And so for your students, I could totally understand like, okay, what am I gonna going to do just like on my own. Like,
Right.
I'm not going to get feedback. I'm not going to be inspired by other students' work.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I like something you said just a few minutes ago, Jeremy, where you said that you almost said like, oh, I wish I could be like my peers who make art for art's sake, but I can't. And I'm always thinking about what it will mean for the future. So, and to me, it's almost like you have this sense of obligation for your work to be more than something for like pleasure or something else. Could you say a little bit more about that and how you look at what you're doing in terms of now and the future?
Oh, sure. I'm trying to think. I'm not very good with my memory. I write everything down and I have to look back and type it into a search to find it. But I think it was like a Susan Sontag book I was reading through, and it was about the morality of photojournalists and how the caption acts as a means to kind of like justify showing what you're showing. So in a way, you can very much guide the viewer's interpretation of an image rather than just like letting it stay out there. And so many contemporary art photographers, they just kind of like put out like this large or medium format image. They put maybe like a hidden title that blends into the wall, and you're supposed to like bring your own experience to that image. But so much of the work that I'm interested in doing, like looking at history and race on Long Island, New York, I kind of feel like I'm being deceptive by just putting out images that might be beautiful on their own, but people are going to be like, oh yeah, I went to the Boy Scouts, so I know all about this, or my dad had a bow and arrow set where he collected arrowheads, so I know all about it. And so a lot of the text that I incorporate as kind of like a mandatory element helps demystify a lot of things that people assume to be true, but really it's kind of like a drop in the bucket of what's actually the truth.
And how will you present that sort of imagery or that sort of information, that textual stuff?
Well, that's where telling stories in the parish would have really thrived in person, because I love the parish and their very large, spacious walls. And every time you enter into a room, you get this like huge wall text that kind of like, oh, I never would have thought that. So there is a catalog that's coming out that has a little bit of a conversation behind it. And personally, I love to self-publish books to both have like a catalog and an archive, but also to explain not only like the content of the image, but also why I even set out to work on this series.
Yeah, I totally get it, where you want to like make an image that's, you know, riveting and captivating and stops people in their tracks and kind of, and to me it's like it's always accompanied by kind of like a what the heck is that moment, where it's like to me is like the art that I get most engaged with, I first am puzzled by, and then if it's engaging me in kind of deep and maybe even profound ways, then I want to find out more and more and more about it. And that's one thing I love about your work. It has like, it's kind of got the movie poster or movie billboard appeal, where it's like if you're driving, like, whoa, I got to go see that one. But then it starts delivering at all different levels. And I think that and it, to me, that also kind of balances you as like as a visual artist and as maybe a historian or a storyteller, someone who's
Absolutely. Well, with my myth work, I came to this point where I no longer was kind of like trying to transcribe these old stories and try to make them into something that can be represented. I sort of bridged the gap between what was myth as we know it and what is kind of prehistory or early colonial period histories, like that early contact period. And for me, that was a means to kind of like say there is no difference between what is myth and these creation stories and what is true, and what like what we say are historians now. We write down everything and reference it. And so I think it's really good to kind of move away from that kind of like binary or black and white.
There's an essay by Nietzsche called On the Advantages and Disadvantages of History for Life. And he talks about how we do history as historians. And he has this idea that some people think you can do it scientifically, which for him is like objectivity, finding the facts and laying them out there. And he said that's a really kind of sorry second-rate way to think about doing history or recording history or writing history or preserving history or creating history. And it's more interesting to think about doing history artistically. And then he brings in emotions, subjectivity, psychology, and all of a sudden history becomes this layered living fabric where it's not just like, oh, this is what happened, but it's like, this is how it looked from this angle, this is how it looked from that angle, this is how it felt from this angle, this is what the police that were all tangled up in it, and it just gets to be a much, knottier, thicker, to me, living enterprise. And it seems that you would be, Nietzsche would think of you as practicing history artistically.
I like that idea because for telling stories and my series Rise, I am kind of looking at history through the emotional lens of fear. As kind of like just like you have the history and it's so well documented, but if you tell someone just that, then they kind of miss out on the whole reason, like why that fear and that emotion led up to kind of like today's circumstances and the conclusion of that history itself. And so to me, going back to that kind of like almost suddenly stopped conversation within that kind of like historical context, for me, it was the Pequot War and the King Philip's War up in New England that I'm looking at. I kind of want to like go back to that and kind of revisit, like you said with Nietzsche, the emotion behind that. And in some senses, I think that emotion's still there for people living today.
I think so. And to me, that's where like then the power of history comes in, where it's like, I wasn't there, I can't possibly know what it was like to be there, but I've been in other situations where I've been powerless, silenced, disregarded, treated like something that's disposable, and that's to me where the beauty comes in, where it's like you don't actually have to exactly duplicate something to understand something. And to me, that's kind of like where the power of storytelling comes in, where it's never like you telling your story and saying to me like, this is the truth, David, revere it. To me, it's about like you telling a story that has all of these loose, open, tangled ends where you can kind of jump in and find connections and also find differences. Well, it's not quite like that for me. And then something grows out of that.
Absolutely. Well, in the Northeast and at Shinnecock, and I guess throughout North America, with the topic of my work being like this very specific, like 17th century Native Americans and using our regalia or our traditional clothing, there is that idea that there's an importance of connecting that past with the present somehow, and using art. That's also another challenge or another layer that I'm trying to overcome. And so with the Rise series and the images that are in telling stories, there's definitely that feeling like, am I in the past, am I in the present, or is this the future trying to be represented? So I really love that time confusion, and that's where I knew like I have to continue this project.
Yeah, and to me, I think something earlier, I don't know if you said it to Corinne or to me earlier about kind of the reality of dreams, where it's like that's to me, that's always us kind of processing stuff in ways that sometimes are kind of incomprehensible, but other times like, whoa, that just nailed something really powerfully. And to me, your work has like almost like a dream or hallucinatory quality to it.
For me, dreams are so important because there's a lot of Native American creation stories that say if you can look at your dreams, I can't personally remember my dreams, but dreams are a means to create new mythical and legendary stories. And so one day, if I'm able to kind of like control that, I hope to continue that storytelling series with the indigenous myths. And I think dreams, like I personally don't practice it as much as I should, but just like how we have like that primal fear, and that's important to us because we know we're in danger, or we have the emotion of being happy because things are stimulating us. Why do we all disregard dreaming as something we all do every single night, but we pay no attention to it, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, some cultures are worse than others at that. But I think that's what the surrealists were trying to get back into the picture. And I think they went, at the time, went right to sex, and like every dream had to become about sex.
Right.
And it was like, and I was totally like, well, yeah, dreams have a lot going on, and it actually, I'm sorry, Sigmund, it's not all about sex and death. It's a lot more stuff. But at least they're bringing it in, kind of getting away from that real kind of narrow, rational, kind of professionalism of the arts that they can sometimes fall into. Yeah. How has your work been responded to by different groups or communities in the Northeast?
More and more, due to just what's happening in the country with police brutality and George Floyd. It just, in some ways, I think a lot of people are seeing the relevance in the work that I'm doing, even though this is a history of 400 years. I suppose it's kind of like pressure in a bottle, like eventually we have to talk about these difficult things. And I didn't grow up like just having like all this frustration, but I'm in the community on the Shinnecock reservation where it's kind of like almost something in the back of the mind or in the back of the consciousness where we're like, well, we've been screwed over so many times, like the courts don't listen to us, the federal institutions don't care about us, like what are we going to do? And at the end of the day, we're about like 1,000 people. We don't really have that much physical might or power that we once had. So in some cases, or in a sense, the Project Rise that I'm working on kind of allows some of that venting or some of that frustration to be represented in like a way that doesn't threaten or harm anyone.
It seems to me you're much more interested in bringing questions to the forefront than you are in about kind of, enacting revenge fantasies, or to me, which could be just like seeking immediate justice.
Yeah, there's definitely, well, the Shinnecock are very patient because we do go through all the loops, and many other tribal nations have gone through the loops of, okay, we have to become civilized, we have to learn English, we have to denounce our religion, but still the things that were promised to us are out of reach.
Yeah, it's always pulled, the goal line changes. It's pulled away. At the beginning of our talk, Jeremy, you said you weren't a very spiritual person. What did you mean by that?
Well, we do have a Presbyterian church on the reservation, and I think my generation is the one where like all the young people stopped going to church, and it's kind of sad because the church, if you look at the history, is what kind of like kept us here. We were technically one of the Indian praying kind of villages or towns, and so the colonists saw us as kind of like, okay, they're converted or they're friendly because they obey the words of the Bible. And so I hope that we take care of it, even if we move away from Christianity and the practices of that religion. But eventually, I kind of want to, maybe if I have a family and raise children, teach them some of the more traditional and Northeastern woodland stories and that spirituality. It kind of feels like you either have to have like that growing up or that kind of community to form that sense of spirituality, which for me, I didn't have that growing up. It was more kind of like spending times in dark libraries looking at these old stories rather than like having that fireplace and having like tribal members telling a story in a circle.
But would you say that as you've, over the years as an artist, you've been finding stronger connections to the past?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think we have a very rich and complex history at Shinnecock, and it's very hard to answer very simple questions that non-Shinnecock people have about us. So one of my goals a little bit more recently is to try to create like a resource or a way to maybe symbolize some of these issues through art or through just text resources. So it is a lot of, at the moment, what I'm doing in my visual art is kind of having more fun or just kind of like learning it through that like entertainment form rather than like, okay, people are starting to notice us, people are starting to want to learn more. And simplifying the narrative comes with its ill effects, but I think it's necessary to get people like into the door and start learning more about it.
Yeah, it's always a balance. You can't talk to people if they're not listening, and so you have to get their ear and then whisper and then shout.
Right.
something like that.
Good approach.
Yeah. And I also think that earlier you talked about things like the spiritual side and the scientific side really shouldn't be opposed or be oppositional. But I also think that's true with entertainment and enlightenment, that you can, just because something's entertaining doesn't mean it's like taking you down the wrong path or taking you in the wrong direction. I think a lot of times classically, that's where like those are the moments where we can actually entertain ideas, where we're not actually trying to get food or trying to kill the mastodon or trying to keep the fire warm so you don't freeze to death. You actually you have a moment of pause and peace and self-reflection. We entertain thoughts. So I like to have a kind of think that art kind of is like a really great way of pivoting from kind of fun entertainment to more serious entertainment.
Absolutely. Well, my mom is a great example of that, because whenever we're like driving around the reservation, she can point out houses and just like one clue to a house that may have been there in the past one day. She has this whole story about who lived there, what they did, and when they were living. So she uses storytelling as a memory bank, and that's very practical and useful. And I think it's just something that we don't rely on as much as anymore.
Yeah, to me, that's a great resource, just to go somewhere with someone who's been there a long time. I drove around Los Angeles with a real estate agent who had been selling homes in the Hollywood Hills for 50 years. And he would he would go by a house and like give me the 4 last owners, which movies they were in, what they were known for, what they were, all the great juicy details. And I was like, would just write by like, oh, here's a bunch of rich people's houses, and that might be neat to live in. But for him, it was like this really living, breathing organism. Or like to walk with my dad through the forest. Like I'm not particularly outdoorsy, and I see trees, and I can tell a pine tree from, I guess, a non-pine tree. But he would like know so much about every single tree, and I just thought, like, wow, his world is so much richer than mine because of that connection and that knowledge. It seems like your mom was bringing that to you.
Yeah, I wish I had that skill, but I think as soon as I was able to like use a computer, I had a computer, and so my brain developed differently to the point like my hard drive is my brain now, so I don't I don't really have to do that anymore.
That can be your forest or your neighborhood.
But my mom is incredible because she did the entire I think it was in the 1990s, the whole family tree for the reservation. Wow. And so her whole kind of memory is trying to verify all of these people to make sure, like, is James like the senior? Is James junior? Where did he live? Can that be verified and everything? That's really incredible.
That's awesome. Well, use your hard drive in that same way.
Working on it.
Yeah, make bigger and more elaborate stories that draw more people in.
Yeah, that's the plan.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Jeremy, for taking the time to do this. I really, really appreciate it. And I thought that when you talked to Corinne, it was a really wonderful kind of account of specific pieces and insights into some of your process. So I wanted this to be like a little bit different and more come at it from a different angle, so people would have different things to see if they watch both.
Oh, well, thank you, David. This was a fun conversation, and looking forward to seeing your next conversations as well.
Oh, great. And thanks again, Jeremy. And I'll see you later.
See you later.
Okay, bye-bye.